But what we find is when we give this money away, when we bail industries out, when we subsidize industries, rarely do we really get a full accounting or an audit of where that money was invested.
When Congress passed what they called an infrastructure bill late last year, it seemed like the right thing to do. But while it had that label on it, the bill wasn't really about our current infrastructure. And the issues that are popping up are not just a government problem, but a private industry problem, too. More than 1,000 train derailments occur every year. Think about that, for the last decade. And the incidents at airports are also happening with unusual regularity, as you just heard from Boston and Cuba. Lots to cover, so joining us is Congresswoman Nancy Mace of South Carolina. So, Congresswoman, I think folks are just kind of starting to learn. They heard about East Palestine, but now that they hear 1,000 a year, or like 3 a day, that's kind of jaw-dropping. What is going on?
It really is. And when you add it up, it's over 1,000 incidents a year. I mean, this is the United States of America. We're supposed to be the most innovative country in the world. We're supposed to have the best infrastructure. But what we see around us in every country, in every state in the country right now, is our infrastructure is crumbling. And Americans, the taxpayers, ought to be asking themselves, asking the federal government, where is that $1.9 trillion going from the infrastructure bill? Is it going to fix our crumbling roads and bridges and rail? Or is it going to set up charging stations for the rich and the elite for their electric vehicles? Every dollar that the federal government spends ought to have a tangible result tied to it, and we ought to audit the money the feds are giving away.
Would you happen to know where the United States stands kind of globally with our safety record, trains, planes, that kind of stuff?
I did a little bit of research this weekend when I saw Norfolk Southern had yet another rail cars that tumbled over in Ohio. About 28 rail cars did. And Europe does not have nearly as many incidences like this as we do. They also have high-speed rail. They've made greater investments in their infrastructure. So it seems, and when you look at what we've done here, the way that the labor unions have had a stronghold over railroad companies, that is always emblematic of a problem. We see it at our ports around the country. Like, we know the ports on the West Coast, the workers didn't want to work 24 hours a day during COVID. Yet here on the East Coast in Charleston, right out in my backyard, you can see behind me, we're on the water. We have a beautiful port behind me, but we work 24 hours a day during COVID. We don't have those same sort of restraints because we're a right to work state. It's all emblematic of a huge problem. And I lay the railroad incidents with Norfolk at East Palestine. I lay it not only at the CEO of Norfolk Southern, I lay it at the governor of Ohio, the Mayor Pete, the head of DOT. All of them are responsible for what happened in East Palestine.
The Federal Railroad Administration says, of those 1,000 each year or so, human error, negligence is the #1 cause. How do we get over that? How do we get better training? But also, we've got old tracks, old equipment. This money would, as you were saying, should seemingly go towards fixing that as opposed to other projects.
Right. No, absolutely. What we need to do, and you're going to hear this often, and I believe the CEO of Norfolk Southern is coming in later this week into the Senate, but we need to bring the CEO and everybody else involved in these 2 incidents in Ohio and get to the bottom of it and ask the right questions in the right way. Give it enough time, more than 5 minutes per member. I think it's going to take more than that to find out what really is wrong. The current administration tried to blame the previous administration, and that was a lie. But what's really going on here? And I don't want to see us politically point fingers in either direction. If there's a problem, clearly there is. Let's figure out how to fix it and do it in an expeditious manner. In the infrastructure bill, that $2 trillion bill, rail was devoted $66 billion. How is that being invested? How is safety involved in those investments? And what are we going to do to make our rail better, faster, and more efficient?
But you wonder, technology was nowhere what it is now, but yet it seemingly, I don't know if they'd ever get home safely if it were today, because a plane, a train, an automobile, it's tough out there. How do we fix this is the big question. I know it's not just about money, though. So how do we fix this?
Well, it's making sure that industries that are subsidized by the federal government, that those investments are made wisely. Look at the Southwest Airlines debacle that happened in December. My two children, teenagers, were stuck in Baltimore and couldn't get home during that debacle. And come to find out, they were given $7 billion in COVID relief funding and didn't do anything very productive. It seems like they didn't update their software, their technology. They were literally using the phone lines, landlines, and cell phones to book their pilots and their flight staff. It's sort of crazy that in 2022 and 2023, that's where that particular airline is. And they got $7 billion from the federal government. But what we find is when we give this money away, when we bail industries out, when we subsidize industries, rarely do we really get a full accounting or an audit of where that money was invested. And that's one of the things that we've got to get to the bottom of when it comes to infrastructure in this country. I know here in the state of South Carolina, we got about $6 billion of that infrastructure bill, but only $1 billion of it was new money. The other $5 billion of the 6 was money we were already going to get. And so, the federal government this administration likes to play a shell game with these investments and pretend they're doing more than they are. And nobody's ever held accountable for it.
Let me turn in the last minute and a half or so towards the Twitter files, because last month you had hearings, you eviscerated the executives at that hearing, and you really called them out, rightfully so, on the censorship that we now know is true. Do you think there's going to be bipartisan support soon, or at some point, that everyone will be held accountable for what happened?
Well, you don't get that sense right now because our Twitter hearings on oversight were very partisan. Meanwhile, the decisions to censor and label certain doctors with misinformation or censorship or disinformation, doctors from Harvard and Stanford, doctors that were educated in some of the best medical schools in the world, Twitter censored those voices. And this is not a partisan issue. We've seen the FBI and the DHS and DNI censor American voices. It wasn't just conservatives and Republicans. There were Democrats that they tried to censor also. And so this should be bipartisan, what's happening in this country. No agent of the federal government has any right to tell a private company what to do, who to censor, who to ban, who to shadow ban, and what to label misinformation. And it should be bipartisan, but so far, like everything else in Congress, it's very divided right now. And it's sort of shocking because we've seen this happen all over the place. It's not just Twitter, it's Facebook. We saw last year the CEO of Facebook admitting that the FBI told them to be wary of the Hunter Biden laptop story and to bury it. They did 7 days before an election, but this is something that affects every American.
What's your definition of holding them accountable? Do you think criminal charges that far?
Well, yeah, one of my frustrations, and pardon me, but I'm only 2 years in, but I'm extremely jaded by the process. We have these hearings. They're good. Jim Jordan is great. Jamie Comer, they're wonderful out there when they're doing these investigations. But so far, no one's getting referred to the DOJ. No one's been fired. And that's the kind of thing that I'm looking for. If you were to lie in your job, cheat or steal, you'd be fired from your job in the private sector, just like every other hardworking middle American. But in the federal government, you might get a raise, you might get promoted. You're never going to lose your job, even when you commit a crime. And so that's got to change. I've been reading whistleblower reports. I read one a couple weeks ago about someone at the Pentagon. They were given basically $1 million to get a $10 billion contract, sole source, non-competitive contract for their favorite software company. This is the kind of thing that is rampant. It goes on throughout our federal agencies. And these people shouldn't have access to the Department of Defense, yet they still do. Something's wrong in this country, and we absolutely have to hold people accountable. Firing them is the first step. If there should be criminal charges filed, then the second step would be to defer them to the DOJ, which I'm fully supportive of on both sides of the aisle.
Congresswoman, we thank you for coming on Centerpoint. We hope to have you back, especially as these oversight hearings continue. Now the long road to the White House. There are a lot of names bouncing around, and it's pretty early in the process. But for a day at least, some of the candidates tried out their messaging at CPAC. Here's Doug McKelway.
So what is the CPAC convention? Well, according to one radio host, it's a great big auditorium filled with people and no Democrats. True that. But this year in particular, it tends to be a grab bag of complaints, all falling under what might have once been considered conspiratorial. But to a lot of conservatives here, many conspiracies have proved true in the last couple of years and in the last couple of months, many of them falling under the rubric of the Great Reset. The Great Reset, quoting from Wikipedia, is an economic recovery plan drawn up by the World Economic Forum in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The initiative's stated aim is to facilitate rebuilding from the global COVID-19 crisis in a way in which prioritizes sustainable development. For many at CPAC, a big target and a key player in the Great Reset was Dr. Anthony Fauci.
Tony Fauci lied under oath. He lied to the American people. And it's not just that. He compelled and persuaded the FBI to censor information about the pandemic as it was unfolding.
Yep.
He tried to shut down, he used his government power to shut down the functioning of the First Amendment so that we could not have an honest and open debate about where COVID came from and what to do about it.
There has been no person who has done more to destroy trust in the scientific and medical community than Dr. Anthony Fauci, who told millions of Americans lies willingly, knowingly, glibly, supremely arrogantly. Should there be an accountability in any sane system, he would be prosecuted for lying under oath, and he would go to jail for lying under oath to Congress.
The main stage at CPAC featured a cavalcade of conservatives warning about the direction of the United States.
This is the most dangerous time in the history of our country, and Joe Biden is leading us into oblivion. In 2016, I declared, I am your voice. Today, I add, I am your warrior. I am your justice. And for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution. I am your retribution. Not going to let this happen.
Americans deserve better than the way we're living today, and I'm confident we can take our country to her best days. The plan I'm calling for will do just that. It's fundamentally conservative and profoundly American, and I know we can unite our people. But real unity doesn't come from faint hearts or watered-down compromises. Real national unity comes from boldly proclaiming our national purpose. It comes from standing on principle and persuading opponents to stand with us.
This is a tough world, both abroad and here. And we can't shift blame to others, but must accept the responsibility that comes to those of us who step forward and lead. Over the last few years, I've heard some who claim to be conservative excuse hypocrisy by saying something like, well, we're electing a president, not a Sunday school teacher. That's true. But having taught Sunday school, maybe we could get both.
Longtime climate change skeptic Marc Morano has recently been pivoting from challenging narratives of global warming to an examination of the Great Reset. Marc Morano, good to see you. This is a very familiar face to TBN viewers, to Fox News viewers, and conservative viewers across the country for your skepticism about climate change. But you're pivoting now a little bit away from climate change to your concerns about vaccine mandates.
Well, one of the things is, everything I know, I've learned about, I've seen with COVID, I learned about during the climate debate. And that's the same template. So I'm trying to issue a call for alarm. This will only happen or continue to happen if we allow it. So I'm showing people that this is a bypassing of democracy, and that's their ultimate goal. The same people who are promoting this, the lockdowns and the COVID authoritarianism, if you go back, look at Apple CEO praising China and how wonderful they are in climate. Justin Trudeau saying he admired China's basic dictatorship. You have Obama administration officials. You have the United Nations climate chief praising China's one-party rule. You have Tom Friedman, New York Times, praising it. So what happens is in March of 2020, the whole world became one-party Chinese rule. You had unelected bureaucrats and presidents, prime ministers, governors, mayors with executive power with no vote making the most consequential decisions of you or I's lifetime since World War II. Decisions that involved kids going to school, canceling business, stay-at-home orders, canceling weddings, funerals, closing churches, all based on a decree without a vote, without any input of democracy. And this is what they loved. This is why Jane Fonda said this was God's gift to the left, COVID. Because for the first time in our lifetime, the once free West emulated the one-party authoritarian rule in China. And that is why I'm issuing the call, because I saw that was the goal during the climate, and I saw it happen in real time. Again, the climate was just a wish list. COVID actually made it happen. And the last thing is, climate can't stand on its own anymore. It just doesn't have the fear factor. So there is now a concerted effort. 230 medical journals, led by the British Medical Journal, Harvard School of Medicine, are now combining COVID and climate, saying unchecked climate leads to more viruses, and that if we want to get viruses under control, we have to mitigate climate. So if you don't support the Green New Deal now, you are essentially a grandma killer. That's the new rhetoric, and it's coming from the most powerful and establishment organs of our society, the top flight medical journals.
Is it fair to say that conspiracy theories is just another word, perhaps an ineffective word for the love of power?
Yes.
The overriding concern here is power and the retention of it.
Yeah, and what's amazing is anyone in the news business knows that in the 60s and 70s, the idea of challenging power, whether it was the Vietnam War, the fact that the government lied, the Pentagon Papers, this was cheered on by the liberal activists, by the mainstream media. They were going to take down Richard Nixon, they were going to take him down, and they didn't trust anything government said. Now, if you challenge anything government says, be it on climate, be it on COVID, somehow you're a conspiracy theorist. This makes no sense, but it makes sense when you realize Bill Gates has pumped tens of millions of dollars into the media. You realize it makes sense when foundations pumping tens of millions on climate, Bill Gates on COVID and public health issues, and you realize the big pharmaceutical funding, things like MSNBC and all the shows that they sponsor, these become untouchable by the establishment. And so the old idea of fighting the man, not trusting the government, challenging what you're told, because government lies. That's what they do. Any journalist should have that, but journalists in the establishment media have forgotten that.
From the failure to enforce laws that protect judges, the proliferation of deadly fentanyl and open borders, the emphasis on diversity, inclusion, and equity over merit in corporate America, in public schooling, in government and military, the widespread practice of canceling, of censorship, shadow banning, and other threats to the First Amendment, all suggest that maybe there's something to the Great Reset, at least according to people at CPAC. It is at its heart a consolidation of power and authoritarianism, a consolidation that attendees at this year's CPAC convention hope to break in the election year of 2024. At the CPAC convention in National Harbor, Maryland, Doug McKelway.